is 1830. The Southern slave economy now has 3 million blacks in bondage. The American Anti-Slavery Society is founded in the North, and in only 7 years has 250,000 members in 15 states, including many free blacks. The South is enraged. 1830s to 1840s, abolitionists and church groups, especially Quakers, push for black education. Southern whites, many of them slave owners themselves, are sentenced to jail for teaching slaves to read and write. Mobs sometimes invade schools, burn books. 1840 to 1850, thousands of blacks escaped to the north, fighting enormous odds. Trailed by slave catchers, many blacks drowned in rivers and swamps. Thousands of men and women in the North and South devote their lives to emancipation, but they face increasingly greater odds. With the most discouraging counterblow of all, the new Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, forcing federal marshals to arrest suspected fugitive slaves. For half a century, from 1810 to 1860, white and black abolitionists in both the North and South secretly helped more than 100,000 slaves steal away to freedom in the North. Harriet Tubman, a South Carolina runaway slave, is the symbol of the Underground Railroad. She makes her own escape in 1840, hiding by day in barns, wading rivers at night, wet and hungry, with only the North Star to guide her, eventually reaching Philadelphia. The stations of the highly organized Underground Railroad are a series of barns and cellars in the South and North, about 21 miles apart, where escaping slaves hide and are fed during the day. Tubman makes 19 trips, risking her life to bring out more than 300 slaves, knowing there's a $60,000 price on her head, dead or alive. Another famous escapee is Frederick Douglass, born a slave in 1817. Eventually, he's to become the most important and eloquent black abolitionist of the 19th century. As a boy, he is taught to read and write by a kind mistress in Baltimore. Back on the plantation, despite hunger and beatings, he never loses faith that he will someday be a free man. At 21, he escapes from Maryland to New York, and only 3 years later, he's a powerful abolitionist lecturer, soon known nationally for his speeches against the inhumanity of slavery and for the right of blacks to vote and equality for women. Sojourner Truth, another noted black abolitionist of this time, also escaped slavery to become an important lecturer not only on black freedom, but also on women's rights.
Hero born of woman, hero born of woman. Crush the serpent with your heel, crush the serpent with your heel. Crush the serpent with your heel, crush the serpent with your heel. Crush the serpent with your heel, crush the serpent, crush the serpent with your heel, crush the serpent with your heel. Crush the serpent with your heel, crush the serpent.
Welcome to Pioneers of American Socialism.
The doctor proceeds, how strange does it appear to the unsophisticated reader of the New Testament to learn from the Holy Evangelist that our Lord Jesus Christ, the divine author of the gospel, and the great source of all its moral power, never once uttered a single sentence against slaveholding, that heinous crime which is worse than piracy and murder. How strange that Jesus Christ never uttered a single word against drinking brandy, against building theaters and brothels, and against running steamboats on Sundays, about which no one doubts the wickedness. How strange does it appear that the doctor should begin at this breath to advocate slavery, when he set out and declared himself in the first page of his extinguisher, so fearlessly, to be the uncompromising enemy of slavery, and the friend of universal emancipation, etc. Uncompromising enemy of slavery. But Jesus Christ never uttered a single sentence against it, although at the time of our Lord's personal ministry, etc., a system of slavery existed under the Roman government which in point of severity far exceeded that of the United States, yet he in no one instance bore testimony against this heinous crime in the sight of God. Now if Dr. Rees was a consistent upholder and advocate of slavery, I would respect him. But for him, a minister of the gospel, to declare in the outset to be the uncompromising enemy of slavery, and then adduce the words of our Savior to prove the contrary, entitles him, I will not say to the contempt of the devil himself, but I shall proceed and expose his fallacy, while I pity his folly. It is well known, as before hinted, that there were many vices which our Lord and Savior never reproved, either because they did not come under his immediate inspection, or because they were species of wickedness, the general principle of which was reproved and condemned, or, whatever species of wickedness was openly reproved or condemned specifically and in detail, underwent the general enunciation of God's displeasure, and the distinctive vices were to be known from characteristic principle, and left to the judgment and discrimination of Christians and men. Now our Savior never said anything against drinking ardent spirits, yet from the principles of temperance and sobriety which the gospel inculcates, I infer that to drink ardent spirits is wrong. Our Savior never spoke distinctly against slaveholding. But he said, Whatever ye would that men should do unto you, do ye the same to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Here is the spirit of the gospel. Now it would seem unnecessary to have added, and if any man have slaves, and these slaves possess the same right to freedom that he does himself, and if he being a slave could wish for freedom, let him give his slaves freedom. I say the principle of the commandment is diametrically opposed to slavery in every shape. How then could the Reverend Dr. Rees undertake to justify slavery by declaring that our Lord Jesus Christ, the divine author of the gospel, never uttered a single sentence against slaveholding? Now let it be understood that although slavery existed, neither our Lord nor his apostles, as often as the latter had occasion to speak of submission of servants to their masters, never once admitted the spirit of slavery as justifiable. Nero, Caesar, and Herod were all wicked rulers and oppressors, and yet neither Christ or his apostles openly, as I recollect, reproved their sins and oppression. Were they therefore good men? Jesus Christ commanded his ministers thus, Go ye into all the world, and teach my gospel to all mankind. And slavery in the United States forbids that this gospel shall be preached, that his name shall be taught to 3 millions of his creatures in this land of Bibles. Still the Reverend Dr. Rees and other professing Christians will wink at slavery, apologize for slavery, and even undertake to prove to the world that Jesus Christ never once uttered a single word against slavery. Now if slavery is not inimical to all the truths and precepts of our Lord Jesus Christ, the divine author of the gospel, what prevents Christians from furnishing 3 millions of their own countrymen and women with his holy Bible? And if it is, why do not Christians obey the divine author, by entering upon the path of duty, and break every yoke, and undo the heavy burdens, and let the oppressed go free? It is out of my province to ministerialize. As I said before, I am no preacher, but the Reverend Dr. Rees's inconsistent and anti-Christian mode of interpreting the Bible, it must be admitted, is enough to alarm the most impenitent. For this reason, if those who are sent to preach the gospel are reckless of its principles, the impenitent will be reckless of his condition, and like the blind leading the blind, they may all fall into the ditch together. Having taken up this subject as Dr. Rees has left it, with a resolution to dissect every limb, the reader will bear with me should I be a little tedious. We must return to the slavery under the Roman government, etc. Here I admit that submission to tyranny was taught by Paul. Is tyranny therefore justifiable? Paul said, Be subject to the powers that be, even the impious tyrannical rule of Nero. Did Paul therefore abet tyranny, and was tyranny right? Upon the same principle of submission to powers that be, over which we have no individual control, Paul says to servants, Be obedient to your masters. Suppose the servants to have been slaves, which was not the case. Did Paul advocate slavery? Certainly not. I have no doubt his meaning was this: servants, by the providence of God you occupy this condition in life. Prove by your submission that Christianity is profitable in every condition of life and every department of society. But if thou canst obtain freedom, use it, rather be free rather than servants. If by any justifiable means thou canst, do all in thy power to raise thy condition from servants to freemen. But the question arises, were those whom Paul addressed servants according to our definition of the word slaves? Being unlearned, I have no means of determining, but will grant the worst, and suppose they were slaves. The severity of their treatment did not very far exceed that of the slaves in the United States. I defy the annals of the world to produce a parallel of cruel treatment to that of some of the slaves in the United States. Why is not that part of the 10th commandment abrogated which says, "Nor anything that is thy neighbor's"? Here is length and breadth enough without straining at the word servant. Anything that is thy neighbor's, anything which he holds in his possession, whether lawfully or not, is no concern of thine. Thou shalt not covet it. Is not this the spirit of the command? To whom, pray, is the command given, to thy neighbor or to thee? If it be admitted that the command, not to covet the man or maid servant of our neighbor, but founded upon the right of our neighbor, to hold man and maid servants, then it will follow very clearly that we may covet whatever our neighbor possesses which he has not obtained or inherited lawfully. Now, to any person willing to admit the truth, the meaning is very plain. The command is to us to do our duty in relation to our neighbor, and it makes no more compromise with slave holding, and yields it no more encouragement than the deity did with Satan when he forbade Michael the archangel to rail against him. We may readily suppose that God, when he gave the commandments to be of moral and perpetual obligation, foresaw that the cupidity of ambitious and despotic men would place others in subjection to them. What, then? The fact only is admitted, not the propriety or right or justice of the thing, and we owe duties to all men, whether they be tyrants or oppressors, or whatever they may be. But the doctor seems to take it for granted that the clause manservant and maidservant means male and female slaves. I have shown that granting this to be the meaning, his application is totally wrong. The meaning of manservant and maidservant, as used in the 10th commandment, appears however to me to be this, viz. that state of subordination and subjection which must necessarily fall to the lot of some, seeing that society is composed of different grades, but which subordination is not incompatible with civil liberty and the heaven-born doctrine of equal rights. Did God ever intend a time when everyone from the least to the greatest should have a jubilee from sin? A day of millennial glory, continuing 1,000 years, when there will be no need for a man to say to his neighbor, "Know the Lord," but when all shall know him from the least to the greatest. If such a time comes, I would ask Dr. Reese where slaves are to be procured. For the Rev. Man vindicates slaveholding from the fact that they, the slaves, never were free or had forfeited their freedom. But when the millennium shall come, no man will forfeit his freedom by his crimes, or by the color of his skin, and then I suppose the obnoxious part of the 10th commandment referred to will be abrogated. Surely it will be useless then, or else slave holding is now absolutely and unequivocally and unqualifiedly right. The doctor did not look far enough ahead this time. He will be just now in his trap again. David Ruggles, 1834.
I saw the fall, saw the night, I saw the man, I saw the white, got in the way of the bloody scene. At the moment did I look mean? I saw a man get beat by police, and now I'm in jail, appealing for peace. I saw the bombs, the shock and awe, saw the fireworks, saw the bombs, fire and shots, hit anything that moved, saw it on TV, and so did you too, but we did nothing when the bombs were dropped. We didn't look, we didn't stop, but we did fight the law, the traffic cops. We marched in the streets against the war. We had to do something, the bombs were already falling. Felt like we had blood on our hands. No blood for oil, history will judge whether our efforts made any change at all. But I know in the streets I didn't feel small.
Broken glass everywhere. People pissing on the stage, you know they just don't care. I can't take the smell, can't take the noise. Got no money to move out, I guess I got no choice. Rats in the front room, rollers in the back, junkies in the alley with a baseball bat. I tried to get away, but I couldn't get far, cause a man with the tojo repossessed my car. Don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes, it makes me wonder how I keep from going under.
Hello and welcome back to another edition of Pioneers of American Socialism. Today we're talking about Black American Socialist pioneers, and so we'll talk a little bit about the Northampton Association, which we talked about last season. We'll get to that in a minute. We're going to take a little bit of a different angle on it this time, but we'll also talk about Black populism around the turn of the century, and Peter H. Clark, who was an early Black member of the Socialist Labor Party, which was one of the first Marxist parties in the United States. So, as I said, we're going to be talking about the Northampton Association and Black pioneers involved with that, abolitionists and sort of pseudo-Fourierists, although they did not espouse the teachings of Charles Fourier, but their constitution was basically a Fourier system. But last season we talked about Sojourner Truth, both in our episode about abolitionist communities and also in our episode about spiritualism in one of our Halloween episodes last season. So we talked about how Sojourner Truth was a member of 3 different utopian communes. She, she was an enslaved person she was a domestic servant in the North who was freed. And then she ended up joining the Kingdom of Matthias, which was sort of a religious, also sort of patriarchal community that ended in scandal and murder. And then she joined the Northampton Association for Education and Industry, which we'll talk about some more. And then she joined, finally, Harmonia in Battle Creek, Michigan, which was a spiritualist utopian community, which I would say still had a significant amount of influence from Charles Fourier. Okay, but this season, since we already covered Sojourner Truth pretty well, we're going to focus on another Black pioneer that was in the Northampton Association, and that is David Ruggles. So according to the David Ruggles Center for History and Education website, I'll just sort of go through a little bit of his biography here. He was born in 1810, African-American abolitionist, writer, publisher, and hydropathic practitioner who was a courageous voice for Black freedom, assisted hundreds in escaping from slavery, and mentored future abolitionist luminaries Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and William Cooper Nell. Ruggles was born in Norwich, Connecticut in 1810, the eldest of 7 children to free Black parents. His father was a blacksmith, his mother was a caterer, and founding member of the local Methodist Church. So he was educated at religious charity schools in Norwich, Connecticut. By 1827, Ruggles was in New York working as a mariner. In 1828, he opened a grocery shop, and by the 1830s, Ruggles became involved in the growing anti-slavery movement in New York, advocating for practical abolitionism, arguing that abolitionists should not philosophize about the day slavery would end, but strive to help all victims of human bondage. He also advocated the use of civil disobedience and self-defense. And what you heard before the song there was a excerpt from David Ruggles's "The Extinguisher Extinguished," which is a polemic against David M. Rees, a doctor who was a colonizationist, member of the Colonization Society. So he believed that blacks should be eventually freed. So he was in favor of gradual emancipation, and then they should be sent to Liberia, colony in Africa. But as you heard Ruggles, he made some good arguments against that and for immediatism, which was really sort of William Lloyd Garrison's contribution to abolitionism, the idea that you should strive for immediate emancipation of all enslaved people. All right, so continuing on, Ruggles' grocery shop at 1 Cortlandt Street was also a circulating library and reading room for African Americans who were denied access to New York's public libraries. His was the nation's first Black-owned bookstore, and there Ruggles sold anti-slavery publications until it was destroyed by a mob. In 1833, the Emancipator and Abolitionist Weekly appointed him as an agent to canvass for subscribers throughout the mid-Atlantic states. By 1834, now on Lispenard Street, Ruggles was also writing regularly, publishing dozens of articles and pamphlets for newspapers throughout the Northeast. Between 1838 and 1841, he wrote, printed, and published the first journal edited by an African American, the Mirror of Liberty. David Ruggles was a visible conductor on the Underground Railroad and helped at least 600 enslaved people to freedom, including Frederick Douglass. Ruggles was also a founder of the New York Committee of Vigilance, which fought against the practice of kidnapping free blacks in New York, as well as fugitive African Americans, and illegally selling them to slavery in the South. Ruggles would openly confront kidnapper slave catchers, and the Vigilance Committee offered their victims legal assistance. Ruggles himself experienced at least one such attempted kidnapping. His brazen and courageous anti-slavery activities made Ruggles one of the most hated abolitionists in New York. In addition to his attempted kidnapping and several efforts to lynch him, his store was burned down and he was physically assaulted multiple times. Even some other black abolitionists criticized his tactics as too extreme and subject to scandal. All this took its toll on Ruggles' health, leaving him weak, ill, and nearly blind. However, in 1842, in failing health, Ruggles moved to what is now Florence, Massachusetts, his name being put before the membership committee of the Northampton Association of Education and Industry, a utopian community established by abolitionists, which we talked about. As he settled in Florence, Ruggles found much-needed companionship and rest. He soon organized a rally of black citizens to support imprisoned Massachusetts abolitionists Charles Torrey and Jonathan Walker. Treating himself with the techniques of water cure then in vogue, David Ruggles recovered some of his sight and much of his health. In 1847, he erected the first building in the nation dedicated exclusively to hydrotherapy. Perhaps his most famous patient was William Lloyd Garrison, but he also treated luminaries Lucy Stone, Mary Brown, John Brown's wife, and Catherine Beecher, as well as Sojourner Truth. Ruggles continually suffered from poor health, the result of injuries incurred by his anti-slavery activism in New York. Tragically, at the young age of 39, his ailments flared up again, and on the 16th of December, 1849, David Ruggles died in Florence, Massachusetts. So they also have a clip here from Frederick Douglass. So Frederick Douglass went and visited Ruggles at the Northampton Association in 1894 and published in Charles Sheffield's History of Florence what he saw at the Northampton Association. So I'm going to play an excerpt of that report from Frederick Douglass, 1894.
Here, at least, neither my color nor my condition was counted against me. I found here my old friend, David Ruggles, not only black, but blind, and measurably helpless, but a man of sterling sense and worth. He had been caught up in New York City, rescued from destitution, brought here and kindly cared for. I speak of David Ruggles as my old friend. He was such to me only as he had been to others in the same plight. Before he was old and blind, he had been a co-worker with the venerable Quaker, Isaac T. Hopper, and had assisted me as well as many other fugitive slaves, on the way from slavery to freedom. It was good to see that this man who had zealously assisted others was now receiving assistance from the benevolent men and women of this community, and if a grateful heart in a recipient of benevolence is any compensation for such benevolence, the friends of David Ruggles were well compensated. His whole theme to me was gratitude to these noble people. For his blindness he was hydropathically treated in the community. He himself became well versed in the water cure system, and was subsequently at the head of a water cure establishment at Florence. He acquired such sensitiveness of touch that he could, by feeling the patient, easily locate the disease, and was, therefore, very successful in treating his patients.
So, following the Civil War, there were a number of biracial, radical Republican governments that were elected throughout the South. African Americans were enfranchised and began to take office for the first time in American history. And the Freedmen's Bureau was established. The radical Republicans controlled Congress, and when Grant was elected, following Lincoln's assassin, and then the traitorous Democrat Johnson administration, that was a total disaster. But once Grant was elected in 1872, he showed himself to be on the side of the radical wing of the Republican Party. So the first Hiram Rhodes was the first African American senator, and there were a number of black Congress people at this time, and also in a lot of state legislatures. Most notably, here's a picture from South Carolina. They had these biracial governments, even local governments, governors. Radical Republicans started to be elected and control these governments. So Reconstruction was their program for the South, and the South was under martial law still at this time, and they were occupied by Union troops. And by an act of Congress, they established the Freedmen's Bureau. But unfortunately, the Freedmen's Bureau was never really fully funded. But the Freedmen's Bureau was meant to help formerly enslaved, newly free, newly politically enfranchised blacks to develop skills and to get the economic opportunities that they would need to become independent, Republican free men in the American, Enlightenment tradition. Finally, the liberal Enlightenment dream of universal enfranchisement would be actually realized, except still not for women. Universal male enfranchisement, but still not for women. Um, so, and like I said, these radical Republican governments were springing up all over. That's where the term carpetbagger comes from, right? Because the idea is that these white abolitionists from the North are coming down and running as Republicans and getting the black folks all uppity. So that's actually where the term carpetbagger originates from. But eventually, Grant, I said something about this actually recently, is that Grant was supposed to be Lincoln's Stalin. When Lenin died, Stalin took over the Soviet Union and ultimately vanquished all the enemies of the revolution, both within and without the party. Finally crushed the remaining remnants of the White Army and any other opposition, from both the right and the left that may have been left. And that's, I think, what Grant should have done. I mean, we can debate about whether Grant really had any will to do that to begin with, but he was elected because he was a military general. He was strong as a leader. He was brave in battle, and he was willing to get dirty and do some violence. Unfortunately, that was not how he governed as president. And like I said, there was corruption. His administration was marred by scandal. So eventually, then in 1876, when Rutherford B. Hayes won the electoral vote but lost the populist vote to the Democrat. I've talked about this before. I talked about this last during our Civil War episode of the last season. But the Compromise of 1877 is what ultimately ended the radical Republican project of Reconstruction. I think, again, too, in some ways, history rhymes, and clearly we weren't and aren't in as revolutionary a moment now. Although I say that, and like Lenin said, there are times when, decades can happen within the span of weeks or something like that, and then there are decades where nothing happens, right? So you never know when the moment is going to arise. But I do think that was a very revolutionary moment in American history. It was the Civil War and Reconstruction afterwards, as W.B. Du Bois writes about in his book as well. And it's not a matter of saying that the radical Republicans never had the will to be anti-racist and to oppose, the slave owners' supremacy, because half of them were black, right? So ultimately, though, I was going to say another parallel with this was sort of the Bernie campaign in 2016. This populist movement had grown within the Democratic Party, and ultimately it was vanquished in a really blatant, really dirty sort of way, by the Democratic Party establishment in 2016. Same thing with the Republican Party in the 1870s. Is there was a moderate wing of the Republicans that didn't want to really shake things up too much with the South. Unfortunately, Horace Greeley, who was a former Fourier socialist, was part of that group and actually ran against Grant from the right in 1872, and so but Grant said he made mistakes, and so that was the end of Reconstruction. Grant, in his 1876 Eighth State of the Union address, said, "I leave comparisons to history, claiming only that I've acted in every instance from a conscientious desire to do what was right, constitutional, within the law, and for the very best interests of the whole people. Failures have been errors of judgment, not of intent." However, in the preface to the second edition of the 18th Brumaire, actually, which Karl Marx dedicates to Joseph Wedemeyer, who had died recently when it was published in 1869. Wedemeyer being the first American Marxist who was a colonel in the Civil War, as we talked about in the Civil War episode last season. So he dedicates the book to Wedemeyer, and then he goes on sort of taking down his critics. One of them, Proudhon, who basically he says is his conception of the French Revolution and the whole situation is totally wrong. And Marx says, "I, on the contrary, demonstrate how the class struggle in France created circumstances and relationships that made it possible for a grotesque and mediocre personality to play a hero's part." So I think we can apply that analysis to a lot of things, right? The American Revolution, the Civil War, and so maybe we can look at Grant as I still kind of see him as the second best president after Lincoln, probably followed by FDR and then JFK. But that he was maybe a grotesque and mediocre personality who did indeed play a hero's part, although that grotesque mediocrity ultimately ended up being what caused the counter-revolution, which Marx demonstrates in the 18th. So, to move on from that, so, the Compromise of 1877 left this radical Republican vision of Reconstruction unfinished, right? It was an unfinished revolution. And so by the 1880s and 1890s, black farmers, many of them sharecroppers, who basically, they may have had their own, cabin or something on somebody else's land, basically a reproduction of the slave system. Also, some of them were agrarian laborers, and they had the double, issue of economic exploitation and economic lack of opportunity, and also the racism. And after the troops left in 77, the Ku Klux Klan basically ran the South for another 100 years, basically until 1964, when they sent the National Guard in again to enforce integration. But in the meantime, 20, 30 years after the Civil War, black populism began to assert itself as a regional force throughout the country, but especially in the South. And they did a lot of different things. So unfortunately, racism and violence against them held them back from maybe what a lot of what they could have done. But here's what they did do. They established farming exchanges. They raised money for schools. They published newspapers. They lobbied for better legislation, mounted boycotts against agricultural trusts, carried out strikes for better wages, protested convict lease system, which was, we kind of still have that today, it is slavery. It's slavery of people that are convicted of a crime. They protested lynching. They demanded black jurors in cases involving black defendants, a jury of your peers, right? Promoted local political reforms and federal supervision of elections so that the Klan couldn't, force black people to stay away from the polls through violence. And then the running of independent and fusion candidates. So, early on, they had groups like the Colored Agricultural Wheels. They worked within the Knights of Labor, which was a union that was willing to accept black members, Cooperative Workers of America, Colored Farmers Alliance. But eventually they helped to launch the People's Party and ran fusion campaigns with the Republican Party as well at the time, who was still, still sort of aligned with the left of center. But even, later on, they too kind of made some alliances with white populist Dixiecrats as well, into the 20th century. By the late 1890s, under relentless attack, political propaganda campaigns warning of, second Reconstruction and, black supremacy in the South and all this kind of thing, they had pretty much crushed the movement. Key figure in the attack on black populism was Ben Tillman, the leader of South Carolina's white farmers movement. The Southern populists knew that they really had only two possible alternatives in the fight against the ruling Bourbon Democrats. Either choose between trying to win the black votes or working to eliminate it entirely. So the Tillman Group in South Carolina sought the latter method. They were completely reactionary on the black question, stood with the Bourbons and disregarding the principles of the 15th Amendment. But elsewhere, populists sought to win black votes through fusion with the Republican minority or raising issues with broad appeal to black farmers. But the third party, People's Party movement, was really the strongest in the South because of their seeking black votes and black support. I know today we really kind of heavily associate populism with racism because the ruling class has brainwashed us into thinking that anything that's for the people is backwards and old-fashioned and reactionary, and this is just using a ruling class framing of things, using this ruling class wokeness ideology to twist the reality of things and really to twist what populism really is, which was a left-wing movement and even anti-racist at points. So now I'll play a clip from a Dallas County Community College telelearning documentary entitled Transforming America, The Populist Challenge from 1996 that I think really demonstrates what I've been talking about as far as...
The community that my family lived in, most of the African American families still had not been able to purchase land, and that was 30 years after the Civil War. And so they were still living on someone else's property, trying to make a living on someone else's terms. They had to pay for everything. They had to pay for seed. They had to pay for fertilizer. They had to pay for the use of farm animals. Even if you had an excellent crop, even if you had a very good, successful agricultural year, the expenses of life that had to be drawn from that were oftentimes at a great cost.
The populists basically say to African Americans, look, we're in the same boat. We're suffering because of what's happening to agriculture in the South and elsewhere, and that if we succeed, that everybody is going to benefit, so vote for us.
African Americans in some ways saw an opportunity in the People's Party. They didn't need to have white folks say that they weren't racist. They were less concerned about people's purity, what they thought, what their intentions were. But what they did, and the thing that they were willing to do, was go out and build a third party with black people.
By telling the truth, I have converted to our political ideas every colored man and woman in Jasper and Newton counties. I've converted at least 50% of my white auditors.
This was the great nightmare. If you think about Southern politics in the 19th century, a lot of it is built around the ability of big landowners to get the support of small landowners. What happens in the 1890s is that this alliance begins to fracture, and they're very frightened, not only because it's a biracial coalition, but because the kind of demands that they're raising challenge the economic framework and relationships that white landowners and merchants depend upon.
And it didn't take long for the populist opponents in the South to play the race card against the populists, appealing to white farmers on grounds of racial solidarity.
It is the religious duty of Democrats to rob populists and Republicans of their votes whenever and wherever the opportunity presents itself. And any failure to do so will be a violation of true Louisiana Democratic teachings.
The way that they attacked was vicious. And they came after them by literally assassinating leaders, by roughing people up, intimidating them, passing new laws.
In spite of these tactics, in 1892, the populists elected a number of candidates across the South and Midwest. In 1893, the nation plunged into a major economic depression.
So somebody that is really representative of the failure of the Republican Party to continue the radical dream of Reconstruction after the Civil War, and then, you know, to go from that and to turn to populism and to socialism and to more radical solutions as a result. So exemplary of that is the life of Peter Humphreys Clark, who was born on March 29th, 1829 in Cincinnati, Ohio. So not down south, a little further north, but still Ohio, you know, having a lot of connections with the South. They share a border with Kentucky and West Virginia, and the southern part of Ohio is really sort of culturally southern. But his father was a barber, and his uncle, John Islam Gaines, was a teacher, and so Peter became the first teacher in a black school. But he was fired in 1853 by the White Board of Education for publicly praising Thomas Paine, the rebel. And you know, as we talked about earlier, you know, there were elements in those revolutionary words of the early, you know, founding fathers that found purchase in the working people. So that was one real example of Peter H. Clark's early political awakening. So, so Peter became an abolitionist. He was a publisher, editor, writer, speaker, participated in the Ohio Conventions of Colored Men, and educated and published his own weekly newspaper. He was appointed the secretary of the 1853 National Convention of Colored Men in Syracuse, New York, by Frederick Douglass, where he drafted a constitution of National Equal Rights League. He also served as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and in 1854 he married his wife Frances Ann Williams. In 1855 he formed the journal Herald of Freedom, which failed, but he then became the editor of a Free Soil Party journal, published in Newport, Kentucky, and owned by William S. Bailey. In 1856, he was on the staff of Frederick Douglass's paper. In 1857, he was rehired by the black trustees in the colored schools, and he was made principal of the Western District School in Cincinnati. So while he was in Cincinnati, he also founded a union for black teachers. He became the principal of Gaines High School in 1866 and held that post until about the same year when he was fired on political grounds. But he left Cincinnati in 1887 to serve as principal of the Alabama State Normal and Industrial School, and in 1888 went to St. Louis, where he taught at the segregated Sumner High School for 20 years. So he did move down south and was witness, to what was going on there. He was, of course, an abolitionist. In the first fugitive slave case in Ohio in 1853, George Washington McQuarrie was taken into custody by men claiming he was an escaped slave. Clark was able to obtain a writ of habeas corpus from Judge John McLean so the case could go before the court. The case was unsuccessful, and McQuarrie was forced back into slavery, unfortunately. So this was something also that we talked about earlier that David Ruggles was very concerned about. David Ruggles himself, although he was born free and was free pretty much all his life, was kidnapped by slavers, and there was an attempt to bring him into slavery down south. So it was a very frightening prospect for somebody, especially for somebody in Clark or Ruggles' position, who had never been enslaved. For them to all of a sudden be kidnapped off the street and forced into trafficked to the south, human trafficked, and forced into slavery. But he became a member of the Republican Party in 1856. But he left the party in about 1872. But he really became soured on Republicans in 1876 after the Compromise of 1876 that ended Reconstruction, the radical Republican vision and the radical wing of the Republican Party. So in 1876, he joined the Working Men's Party of the United States, which we've talked about a lot, right? The first Marxist Party in the United States, which Woodhull and lots of others were involved in. At that time, the Working Men's Party was to become the forerunner of the Socialist Labor Party. The following year, 1877, he spoke to a crowd of thousands in Cincinnati in support of strikes in the Great Railroad Strike, denouncing the repression of the strikers by the state. The speech was panned by the local press, but was warmly received by socialists. Clark even ran as a Working Men's Party candidate for state school commissioner the same year, and became the first black socialist to run for office in the United States, though he wasn't elected. But he did win about 8,000 votes. Now, not the first socialist candidate, obviously, but the first black socialist candidate. In 1878, he ran for Congress on the Working Men's Party ticket, and was one of the Working Men's Party's first congressional candidates. He ran in Ohio's first congressional district and got 275 votes, which was about 1.09% of the vote. But he left the Socialist Labor Party in 1879. And declared that the welfare of the Negro is my controlling political motive, doubting that the Socialist Labor Party shared his viewpoint, similar to what happened with the black populace as well. In 1882, he helped county Democrats to organize a civil rights bill, which was eventually passed into law. He did have 3 children. His daughter was a doctor and graduated from the School of Medicine at Boston University, Consuelo Clark. But Clark died on June 21st, 1925. And so I think it's appropriate, before we go to our new segment this season, the American Socialist Travels on Location segment. But we'll first enjoy a reading from different voices of Peter H. Clark's speech during the Great Railroad Strike to the strikers.
Gentlemen, if I had the choosing of the motto for this meeting, I should select the words of the patriotic and humane Abraham Lincoln, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. These words, so full of the charity which we should exercise toward each other, are especially suited to this day and time, when wrongs long condemned have at last been resisted and men are bleeding and dying in the busy center of our population, and all over the land other men, with heated passions, are assembling to denounce the needless slaughter of innocent men who, driven by want, have appealed to force for that justice which was otherwise refused to them. I sympathize in the struggle with the strikers, and I feel sure that in this I have the cooperation of 9/10 of my fellow citizens. The poor man's lot is at best a hard one. His hand-to-hand struggle with the wolf of poverty leaves him no leisure for any of the amenities of life. His utmost rewards are scanty supply for food, scanty clothing, scanty shelter, and if perchance he escapes a pauper's grave, he is fortunate. Such a man deserves the aid and sympathy of all good people, especially when, in the struggle for life, he is pitted against a powerful organization such as the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad or Pennsylvania Central. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was taken possession of by the government during the war, and was rebuilt in a manner, from end to end. Such a firm roadway, such tunnels and bridges, are rarely seen as are possessed by that road, and at the end the road was turned over to its owners in a better condition than it had ever been, so that much of the outlay which other roads are compelled to make was saved to this. They were paid for the use of the road many millions of dollars, and the managers have lately declared a dividend of 10%, and if their stock was watered, as I have no doubt it is, this 10% is equivalent to 15 or 20% upon the capital actually invested in it. Yet this road, so built, so subsidized, so prosperous, if we may judge from its dividend, declares itself compelled to put the wages of its employees down to starvation rates. Either they were not honestly able to declare the dividend, or they are able to pay living wages to the men whom they employ. The blood of those men murdered at Baltimore cries from the ground against these men who by their greed have forced their men to the desperate measure of a strike, and then invoked the strong arm of the government to slaughter them in their misery. The too ready consent of the state and national governments to lend themselves to the demand of these wealthy corporations cannot be too severely condemned. Has it come to this, that the president of a private corporation can, by the click of a telegraphic instrument, bring state and national troops into the field to shoot down American citizens guilty of no act of violence? For you observe that neither at Grafton, Baltimore or Pittsburgh was there violence offered to persons or property until the troops were deployed upon the scene. At Grafton it is noticeable that women, wives and mothers, were the chief forces employed by the strikers to keep others from taking their places. The sight of the soldiery fired the hot blood of the wronged men, and they met force with force. Whether they are put down or not, we are thankful that the American citizen, as represented by these men, was not slave enough to surrender without resistance the right to appeal for a redress of grievances. When that day comes and a mere display of force is sufficient to awe a throng of Americans into submission, the people will have sunk too low to be entrusted with self-government. Those men will be avenged, nobly avenged. Capital has been challenged to the contest, and in the arena of debate, to which in a few days the question will be remanded, the American people will sit as judges, and just as surely as we stand here, their decision will be against monopolists and in favor of the working men. In 20 years from today there will not be a railroad in the land belonging to a private corporation. All will be owned by the government and worked in the interests of the people. Machinery and land will, in time, take the same course, and cooperation instead of competition will be the law of society. The miserable condition into which society has fallen has but one remedy, and that is to be found in socialism. Observe how all civilized communities pass from a condition of what is called prosperity to one of depression and distress. Observe how continually these fluctuations occur, how the intervals between them grow shorter, how each one is more violent than the last, the distress produced more widespread. Observe, too, that after each the number of capitalists decrease, while those who remain grow more wealthy and more powerful, while those who have failed join the great army of workers who hang forever on the ragged edge of pauperism.
The so-called periods of prosperity are more properly periods of unrestrained speculation. Money accumulates in the hands of the capitalists, through some governmental device as a tariff or the issue of greenbacks. This abundance tempts men to embark in business enterprises which seem to promise rich returns. For a time all goes well, shops are crowded with busy men, and all are ready to say, "Behold how prosperous we are." But there comes a check to all this. The manufacturers begin to talk about a glutted market. There has been overproduction. There comes the period of sharp competition. Prices are reduced. Goods are sold at cost below cost, then comes the crash, bosses fail, shops are closed, men are idle, and the miserable workmen stand forth, underbidding each other in the labor market. If the competition be too sharp, they resort to strikes as in the present instance. Then comes violence, lawlessness, bloodshed and death. People who talk of the anarchy of socialism surely cannot have considered these facts. If they had, they would have discovered not a little of anarchy on their side of the question. It is folly to say that a condition of poverty is a favorable one, and to point to men who have risen to affluence from that condition. For one man who is strong through the hindrances of poverty, there are 10,000 who fail. If you take 10,000 men and weigh them with lead and cast them into the midst of Lake Erie, a few may swim out, but the majority will be drowned. This condition of poverty is not a favorable one either for the individual or for the nation. Especially is it an unfavorable condition for a nation whose government lies in the hands of all its citizens. A monarchy or an aristocracy can afford to have the mass of its citizens steeped in poverty and ignorance. Not so in a republic. Here every man should be the owner of wealth enough to render him independent of the threats or bribes of the demagogue. He should be the owner of wealth enough to give leisure for that study which will qualify him to study and understand the deep questions of public policy which are continually demanding solution. The more men there are who have this independence, this leisure, the safer we are as a nation. Reduce the number, and the fewer there are, the more dangerous the situation. So alarming has been the spread of ignorance and poverty in the past generation, that whole cities in our land whose states, indeed, are at the mercy of an ignorant rabble who have no political principle except to vote for the men who pay the most on election days and who promise to make the biggest dividend of public stealing. This is sadly true, nor is the Negro, scarcely 10 years from slavery, the chief sinner in this respect. That this evil of poverty is partially curable, at least, I am justified in thinking, because I find each of the great political parties offering remedies for the hard times and the consequent poverty. Many wise men, learned in political economy, assure us that their doctrines, faithfully followed, will result in a greater production of wealth and a more equal division of the same. But as I have said before, there is but one efficacious remedy proposed, and that is found in socialism. The present industrial organization of society has been faithfully tried and has proven a failure. We get rid of the king, we get rid of the aristocracy, but the capitalist comes in their place, and in the industrial organization and guidance of society his little finger is heavier than their loins. Whatever socialism may bring about, it can present nothing more anarchical than is found in Grafton, Baltimore and Pittsburgh today. To increase the volume of the currency, which is the remedy proposed by some, means simply that money shall be made so abundant that the capitalist, in despair of any legitimate returns in the way of interest, shall embark in any and all enterprises which promise returns for the idle cash in his coffers. It means a stimulation of production in a community already suffering from excess of production. It means speculation, competition, finally a reduction of values, bankruptcy, ruin. The American people have traveled that path so frequently in the past 50 years that it requires no prophetic powers to map out the certain course which will be pursued. Already our capitalists rush to invest their money at 4.5% in markets which a short time since gave readily 2% a month. Increase your volume, let it be either greenbacks or silver, and we enter on the career I have described with the certainty that the gulf at the end is deeper and more hopeless than the one in which we now wallow. Trades unions, grangers, sovereigns of industry, cooperative stores and factories are alike futile. They are simply combinations of laborers who seek to assume toward their own unfortunate fellows who are not members the attitude that the capitalist assumes toward them. They incorporate into their constitutions all the evil principles which afflict society. Competition, overproduction mark their stores and factories as much as do those of individual enterprises, and when the periodic crash comes, they succumb as readily as any. All these plans merely poultice the ulcer in the body politic which needs constitutional treatment. The momentary improvement they produce is always succeeded by a corresponding depression. The old fable of Sisyphus is realized, and the heavy stone rolled to the top of the mountain with infinite labor rolls back again. The government must control capital with a strong hand. It is merely the accumulated results of industry, and there would be no justice should a few score bees in the hive take possession of the store of honey and dole it out to the workers in return for services which added to their superabundant store. Yet such is the custom of society. Future accumulations of capital should be held sacredly for the benefit of the whole community. Past accumulations may be permitted to remain in private hands until, from their very uselessness, they will become a burden which their owners will gladly surrender. Machinery too, which ought to be a blessing but is proving to be a curse to the people, should be taken in hand by the government and its advantages distributed to all. Captain Cutler wrote in his Song of Steam. Soon I intend ye may go and play, while I manage this world myself. Had he written, ye may go and starve, it would have been nearer the truth. Machinery controlled in the interests of labor would afford that leisure for thought, for self-culture, for giving and receiving refining influences, which are so essential to the full development of character. The ministry of wealth would not be confined to a few, but would be a benefit to all. Every railroad in the land should be owned or controlled by the government. The title of private owners should be extinguished, and the ownership vested in the people. All a road will need to meet will be a running expense and enough to replace waste. The people can then enjoy the benefit of travel, and where one man travels now, 1,000 will travel then. There will be no strikes, for the men who operate the road will be the recipient of its profits. Finally, we want governmental organization of labor so that ruinous competition and ruinous overproduction shall equally be avoided, and these commercial panics which sweep over and engulf the world will be forever prevented. It will be objected that this is making our government a machine for doing for the citizen everything which can be more conveniently done by combined than by individual effort. Society has already made strides in the direction of socialism. Every drop of water we draw from hydrants, the gas that illumines our streets at night, the paved streets upon which we walk, our parks, our schools, our libraries, are all outgrowths of the socialistic principle. In that direction lies safety. Choose ye this day which course ye shall pursue. Let us, finally, not forget that we are American citizens, that the right of free speech and of a free press is enjoyed by us. We are exercising today the right to assemble and complain of our grievances. The courts of the land are open to us, and we hold in our hands the all-compelling ballot. There is no need for violence.
American Socialism travels on location.
So, we're here once again. Actually, this is one of the only on-location reports I did last season, but actually you only heard the audio of that because it was kind of audio only last season. But we are here now with the visual benefit of the Asa Hulda Anthony grave stone here, Anthony family. You can see, unfortunately, because of the slope of this part of the cemetery, there's been some erosion. One of their children's graves here has been damaged. But Asa and Hulda Anthony were extremely important because they were members of the Fourierist-Sodus Bay phalanx, which I talked about a little bit when we talked about the Fourierist movement last season. But they were also participants on the Underground Railroad, and we know this for a fact. Now, I actually haven't poured through the data myself, but I know of the existence of evidence that they participated in the Underground Railroad because their home, which I will show a picture of here, was... Actually, I used to live near the Anthony house, and there's a historical marker there that indeed confirms that they participated on the Underground Railroad. And so to go through the whole process of registering it as a historical landmark, you have to prove with documents that it was, in fact, and it's also on the Underground Railroad Trail. So Asa and Huldah Anthony also knew Frederick Douglass, were founders, among the founders of the Rochester, Western New York Anti-Slavery Society, along with the Posts, and also Benjamin and Sarah Fish, who are also Quakers. The Posts, the Anthonys, and the Fishes were all Quakers. The Anthonys and the Fishes were involved in the Fourierist movement and the Sodus Bay Founders. So we'll move on to another part of the cemetery and talk a little bit about Frederick Douglass and how he was sort of an intersection of the nexus of all these social movements. So we're here at the grave, more towards the front of the cemetery, more towards Mount Hope Avenue side. But this is the grave of Frederick Douglass. Again, one of the founders of the Western New York Anti-Slavery Society, as I said, along with the Anthonys, Fishes, the Posts, very prominent Quaker abolitionists in Rochester, radical Hicksite Quakers. Frederick Douglass, now I read actually in some conservative outlet, National Review or something like that, that Frederick Douglass would have totally been opposed to socialism, and he was totally for free labor, free market, and was totally against socialism. Well, so when John Anderson Collins of the Skinny Atlas community, which we talked about last season in the abolitionist communities episode, when he organized a lecture for Douglass in Syracuse in 1842, he opened the lecture by speaking on socialism. This angered Douglass. He was actually really mad that he subordinated the cause of abolitionism to what he considered Collins's sort of pet theory of communal living. So, okay, he was angered, but later on in 1843, Douglass and Collins together organized a convention of social reorganization that had both abolitionists and utopian socialists speaking. Aiden Bayou of Fruitlands and William Lloyd Garrison of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and many others spoke at this convention of the Friends of Social Reorganization. And it was right before they started getting the Skinny Atlas community going up there. So again, too, Douglass was friends with and knew the Anthonys, who were involved in the Charles Fourier-inspired Sodus Bay Phalanx communal situation there. So Douglass was definitely a part of communities that were friendly to socialism, and definitely knew and was comradely in organizations like the Western New York Anti-Slavery Society, with utopian socialists who were inspired by Charles Fourier and a radical reading of the Quaker Elias Hicks and his version of Quakerism.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long ways from home, a long ways from home. Oh, my brother, a long ways from home, a long ways from home. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. A long ways from home. A
city of the ancient world. The magnificent facade of the empire, however, could not conceal the seeds of decay. The unhealthy dependence of the economy on slaves, the disparity between rich and poor. Behind the splendor of the Forum were vast areas of crowded slums. Escape from the slums was difficult, for there were few jobs available, practically none for the unskilled. To keep idle citizens entertained and out of mischief, frequent games and spectacles were held at public expense. At first, only chariot races were sponsored, but by the reign of Trajan, brutal combat to the death had become popular. Earlier in Rome's history, elected representatives exercised the power, but by now every function of government had been absorbed by the emperor, who was above the law and ruled by decree. There are people as civilized as the Romans, with the most humane system of law ever devised, would tolerate the violation of human beings is astonishing. This imbalance and the irresponsible behavior of public officials would become major reasons for Rome's eventual decline.
Justice for the oppressed, succor for the sick, for I am the Rabboni, I am your Savior, am your Savior.
Hello. I'm going to read a declaration of the state of war. This is the first communication from the weatherman underground. Kids know the lines are drawn. Revolution is touching all of our lives. Freaks are revolutionaries, and revolutionaries are freaks.